The plastic guardrail on my hospital bed clicked softly as I shifted, the dim lights casting long shadows across the ward. I was still weak from the collapse earlier that afternoon, my arms heavy, my breath steady but thin. When I saw my son pacing near the doorway, something in his movements pulled at me, a sharpness I hadn't seen before. His eyes kept darting toward the nurse's station, as if he was waiting for something to clear out. I felt a quiet tension settle inside me, the kind that doesn't announce itself but sinks in slowly. That was the moment danger first took shape in the room. He stepped closer and told the nurse he wanted some private time with me. His voice tight and impatient. She paused, studying him in a way that made my stomach turn. There was no kindness in her expression now, only assessment, like she was checking the weather before a storm. I watched her look from him to me, and that small exchange made my skin prickle. Something in her posture said she didn't trust what she saw. When he stepped out again to answer a call, the nurse moved quickly to my bedside. Her face was close, her voice barely a breath. "Don't stay alone with him tonight." The words hit me harder than I expected, cutting through the fog of medication and exhaustion. She didn't look away. She didn't soften her tone. Her eyes held the weight of someone who had already seen too many things go wrong. My heart thudded once, slow and heavy, as I tried to understand what she was telling me. I opened my mouth to ask her why, but she shook her head with a small, firm motion. There was no panic in her expression, only a grim certainty that chilled me more than alarm would have. She straightened her posture when she heard footsteps returning and stepped aside, slipping back into the role of a neutral professional. But the warning stayed behind, settling into every corner of the dim ward. My son walked back in with a smile stretched too wide, his voice suddenly soft and warm, as if he'd been rehearsing sweetness. He pulled the chair close to the bed and said he planned to stay with me all night just to be safe. The shift in his tone felt wrong in my bones, like a door closing quietly behind me. I watched him sit, the smile still fixed, his hands too still on his lap. And in that moment, with the nurse's whisper echoing through the dim light, I understood this wasn't concern. Something else had brought him here tonight, and whatever it was, it had nothing to do with taking care of me. The morning light through the ward window was pale and unfriendly, the kind that makes everything look a little older, a little worn. I lay there listening to the soft hum of machines, and for the first time in a long while, I let myself think about how much had changed since my wife passed. Grief had a way of making the house feel too big and my own body feel too unreliable. The collapse yesterday wasn't my first health scare, and each one reminded me that age wasn't something I could bargain with. That vulnerability opened a door, and my son had stepped through it months ago, at first with kindness I was grateful for. I remembered how he started visiting more often, insisting on driving me to appointments, just to make sure I didn't get too tired. He organized my medications, lined them up on the counter, and told me which ones to take when. I appreciated it then, thinking it was simply a son trying to care for his father. But slowly, almost quietly, that care began to feel heavier, as if his hand lingered too long on parts of my life I once managed alone. Small comments about my diet, my routines, even my walks to the store started sounding like critiques instead of concern. It wasn't long before he was speaking to doctors in my place. I would open my mouth to answer a question and he'd cut in with a polished explanation, his tone slipping into something authoritative. When I asked him to let me handle my own conversations, he would smile like I was a child insisting on tying my own shoes. The first time he mentioned my memory not being what it used to be, I laughed it off, because I knew it wasn't true. But the doctor had looked at me with a hint of worry, and that small seed stayed with me long after the appointment ended. Over the months, I noticed something else, something I didn't want to believe at the time. Whenever I recovered quicker than expected, his expression would tighten for just a second. When I walked without help, when my tests came back normal, when I showed strength he didn't anticipate, there was a flicker of frustration. A tiny, sharp look he tried to hide. Back then I told myself I imagined it. I didn't want to think my own son would prefer me weaker. But now, lying in this bed with the nurse's whisper still echoing in my ears, every one of those moments began to shift into focus. Her warning cut through months of denial, and suddenly all the subtle red flags lined up in a clear, chilling pattern. If she had seen something dangerous in him last night, maybe it wasn't new. Maybe it had been building all along while I failed to see it. The pill cup sat on the tray when I woke from a short, uneasy doze. The tablets inside were larger than the ones I was used to, a different color too, dull instead of bright. My hand hovered over them, but something in my chest tightened with a quiet warning. I'd taken the same dosage for months. Change didn't happen without a conversation. When my son stepped back into the room, he noticed my hesitation and smiled in a way that felt practiced. He said the doctor approved a stronger dose to help me rest. The words slid out too smoothly, as if he'd rehearsed them. A few minutes later, a nurse came in to check my vitals. Her eyes lingered on the cup, then on me. When my son stepped into the hallway to take a call, She leaned close and whispered that no changes had been made to my prescription. Her voice was soft, but her expression held something firmer, a quiet warning wrapped in professionalism. I felt a cold shift inside me, the kind that comes when the ground beneath your life moves in a way you didn't expect. Her certainty clashed sharply with my son's confident explanation. After she left, I looked around the bedside table and found the small laminated medication chart tucked under the tray. One glance was enough. The handwriting listing the new dosage wasn't the doctor's. I'd seen my doctor write dozens of notes over the years, tight, neat lettering always in the same pen. This was different, slanted and rough, as if written quickly. The realization hit harder than I thought it would. Someone had taken the time to make it look official, but not enough time to make it believable. When my son returned and saw me holding the chart, his smile thinned. He brushed it off as a clerical mix-up and told me not to get worked up. Later, as he stepped toward the hallway again, he didn't notice I was still awake. I heard his voice slip into a harsher tone, low, impatient. "This has to go smoothly," he said to someone on the other end, not caring enough to speak quietly, not realizing those words were heavier than any raised voice. That single line pulled every suspicion closer, tightening them into something real. I didn't react. I didn't ask. I just lay there, letting the truth settle. From that moment, I started noting every shift, every inconsistency, every unexplained change, quietly, carefully. If someone was altering the path of my care, I needed to see it clearly before I fought back. The hallway outside my room was quiet enough that my footsteps felt louder than they should have. I asked the charge nurse if we could speak somewhere private, and she led me to a small consultation alcove. The lights were soft, the air cold, and for a moment I wondered if I was overreacting. But the look she gave me when I asked to review my medication history told me she already sensed something was wrong. She pulled up my file, scrolling through the logs with a calm, practiced hand. Her brow tightened almost immediately. She turned the screen toward me and pointed at several entries marked "Requested Dosage Change." The timestamps showed late-night attempts for stronger sedatives, but each one was blocked by system safeguards. No one had spoken to me about this, and she confirmed she hadn't either. Her voice stayed professional, but the tightening in her jaw said enough. She didn't want to alarm me, yet she couldn't explain why someone would try to push medication I didn't need. The sight of those blocked entries felt like a steady hand pressing down on my chest. As she looked deeper into the system, another detail appeared, an access log tied to an unidentified external device. It wasn't a staff log, and it wasn't the doctor. Someone outside the approved list had tried to view my file. That realization brought a slow, cold understanding. Accidents didn't happen this way. This required intent, time, and willingness. She printed a copy, slid it discreetly toward me, and told me to keep it somewhere safe. Her tone stayed even, but her eyes were firmer now, as if she knew this was bigger than protocols. When I returned to my room, the dietitian stopped by to check my evening meals. As she adjusted the tray, she mentioned someone had asked earlier if my diet could be switched to soft foods only, to help with swallowing. She hadn't approved the change because the request came from someone who didn't identify themselves. I felt something inside me settle into a darker certainty. Someone was trying to shape every part of my care without ever speaking to me. When my son walked in moments later, pushing a general medical release form toward me, telling me it would make things simpler, it felt like confirmation rather than coincidence. I signed nothing. I smiled, nodded, and placed all the printed chart copies beneath my folded clothes in the drawer. Every piece of evidence went where only I would think to look. What began as suspicion had hardened into something clearer. This wasn't confusion or clerical error. This was coordinated, deliberate, and growing. The cup was warm when my son placed it in my hand, the steam rising gently against the dim hospital light. He said it was herbal tea, something to help me sleep after a long day. His voice sounded soft, but there was a stiffness under it, a rehearsed calm I had heard before. I lifted the cup out of courtesy, taking a small sip. The taste was wrong, bitter, metallic, nothing like the mild teas the nurses usually offered. Within seconds my vision blurred at the edges, and a heavy wave rolled through my head, making the room tilt. I set the cup down slowly, pretending the dizziness came from standing too fast. Through the haze I saw the nurse pass by the doorway, and I called her in with a small gesture. My son stepped aside, acting annoyed by the interruption. She asked routine questions, checked my vitals, frowned at the cup, and quietly confirmed that no sedatives or sleep aids had been ordered for me. Her voice stayed neutral, but her eyes darted toward my son with sharp caution. When she left, she squeezed my shoulder lightly, as if to say the situation was already noted. When my son stepped out to take a call, he left his jacket draped over the chair. I leaned forward despite the fog in my head and saw a small tissue slip from the pocket. Inside were improvised pills, uneven and unmarked. Nothing the hospital would dispense. My hand tightened around the railing, the dizziness sharpening into fear. It was clear now that the tea was not meant to comfort me. I folded the tissue quietly and placed it under my blanket where he wouldn't see it. He walked back in moments later, irritation etched into every movement. He told me to rest now, and stop questioning every small thing people tried to do for me. His smile was thin, his eyes restless, the tone of a man losing patience with someone he needed compliant. As he adjusted my pillow, thinking I couldn't hear him clearly, I caught the low words he muttered. "He won't last long if things go right." They were spoken like a private truth, not meant for anyone's ears. I lay there still, keeping my breath steady, the dizziness slowly fading while everything else became painfully sharp. Whatever excuses I had made for him before were gone. This wasn't about help or concern anymore. Something had already begun, and my safety was no longer a question. It was in immediate danger. The doctor closed the door behind him with a quiet click, the kind that tells you the conversation isn't routine. I sat up straighter on the bed, still feeling the faint residue of dizziness from the night before. He pulled a chair close, notepad in hand, his expression steady but weighted. Without circling around it, he told me he had reviewed my chart after concerns were raised by the nursing staff. Several attempted alterations had been blocked. Requests for stronger sedatives, changes to my diet, even notes suggesting I needed constant oversight. None of them came from him. I felt my chest tighten, not from fear but from the confirmation I had hoped wouldn't come. He showed me a printed log, small timestamps aligning with the hours my son had been present in the ward. Some requests had been entered using an external device, not a hospital terminal. The doctor didn't accuse anyone outright, but the implications hung heavy between us. His voice lowered as he said he had seen similar patterns before, cases where family tried to influence care to gain control over a patient's decisions. A hospital advocate joined us next, a calm woman with a firm posture. She sat across from me and laid out several short call reports. Someone had phoned the ward 3 times that week asking questions about my medications, my capacity, and whether I had signed any medical directives recently. Each call used my son's name. She said the staff flagged it because the inquiries came during hours when he claimed to be on the road and away from the hospital. Her tone never rose, but every word carried the weight of practiced caution. They asked if I wanted to restrict access and update my rights. I nodded before they even finished the question. The advocate explained that people sometimes push for authority when they believe a patient is vulnerable or unlikely to resist. She spoke of medical power, of attorney, and how easily decisions could shift if someone gained influence over a chart. I listened quietly, feeling the ground under me shift in a way that was far more unsettling than the collapse that brought me here. The doctor documented my request to limit all non-staff access. The advocate placed a temporary block on updates being shared without my consent. She assured me I would be consulted before any change, no matter how small. It felt like placing locks on doors I didn't know someone had already tried to open. Later that afternoon, the advocate returned with one more detail. My son had approached the discharge desk earlier, asking when he could start planning my release. He had done it without my knowledge, without even stepping into the room to speak to me first. The timing was too neat, too urgent, too coordinated. The stakes had shifted again, this time not just inside the hospital, but in whatever waited for me outside it. The hallway lights dimmed toward evening, leaving the room washed in a muted amber glow. I sat upright, blanket pulled over my lap, the folder of evidence tucked beneath it. My hands were steady, but my breath carried a slow weight I couldn't quite shake. I had told my son earlier that I would sign whatever he needed tonight, keeping my voice even, letting him believe the resistance had drained out of me. The lie sat cold in my chest, but it was the only way forward. The doctor passed by the doorway once, giving a small nod that told me everything was in place. The advocate and an administrator were stationed nearby under the guise of routine evening rounds. Their presence was quiet, subtle, but deliberate. They weren't here to interfere unless needed, only to witness. Knowing they lingered just out of sight steadied something inside me, even as the air grew tight with anticipation. My son entered moments later, the door swinging shut behind him with a sharper sound than usual. His impatience showed in the way he exhaled, in the abrupt movements of his hands as he set a stack of forms on the side table. He didn't bother masking the confidence in his posture. He looked like a man stepping into a victory he believed was guaranteed. His eyes flicked toward the hallway before he pushed the door fully closed, sealing us in with an air of practiced authority. A knock followed before he could speak. It was my neighbor from across the hall, visiting her sister in another bed. She leaned in briefly, eyes narrowing as she glanced at him. He looked angry coming in. She whispered, barely moving her lips. Then she stepped back out, the wheels of a meal cart masking her retreat. The warning settled over me like a weight, confirming what the room's silence already suggested. My son stepped closer, tone softening in a way that felt more rehearsed than sincere. He laid out the papers with deliberate care, smoothing each corner as if preparing something delicate. I noticed the slight tremor in his eagerness, a quiet urgency beneath his calm exterior. He talked about discharge, about decisions needing to be made for my own good, but never once asked how I felt or what I wanted. I kept one hand under the blanket, fingertips touching the folder edge, grounding myself in the truth waiting within it. The documents I had collected, the logs, the blocked requests, they were the only barrier between what he intended and the life I still meant to keep. He slid the first form toward me, pen already uncapped, his eyes fixed on mine with an expectant certainty. The room felt smaller, heavy with unspoken pressure, the air thick enough that each breath felt measured. The tension rose without a sound, filling the space between us as he prepared to push the papers into my hands. The moment for truth was drawing close, and there was no turning back. The pen in his hand hovered inches from mine. The papers angled so all I had to do was sign. His voice softened, too smooth, urging me to just get this done. I watched the way his fingers tapped beside the signature line, an impatient rhythm betraying the calm expression he was trying to hold. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from the cold clarity of seeing him exactly as he was in that moment. When he pushed the papers closer, I let my hand drift away instead of forward. I lifted my eyes toward the doorway, a small but deliberate gesture. It was enough. The door opened without a knock. The doctor stepped in first, his expression firm but controlled. The advocate followed, a folder tucked against her side. The administrator entered last, closing the door behind her with a quiet click that sounded far louder inside the still room. My son's shoulders stiffened, the confidence draining from his face as quickly as water slipping through fingers. He tried to straighten, but the shift in the room left him off balance. His gaze darted between us, searching for some explanation that wouldn't land. The doctor moved to my bedside and rested a hand lightly on the tray table, as if anchoring the moment. The advocate opened her folder and laid out printed logs, medication records, and timestamps with calm precision. Each sheet made a soft tap against the metal surface, quiet but final. My son's breathing changed, sharp and uneven, the veneer of control slipping at the edges. "What is this?" he asked, voice cracking at the end. It wasn't anger yet, just fear wearing the shape of confusion. The advocate didn't answer his question. Instead, she slid forward the log showing attempted medication changes made under his name, followed by the record of calls flagged as suspicious by the hospital system. Her tone was measured as she explained each one, never raising her voice, never accusing, just stating the facts. He took a step back, hands lifting in a weak defense. "I was stressed," he said quickly, shaking his head. "You people don't understand. He needs help. I was only trying to make things easier." His voice wavered, slipping between excuses too quickly, as though one might finally sound believable. The administrator watched him closely, her posture steady, her silence louder than any challenge. Then he slipped. "If I didn't take control now, it'd be too late," he muttered, eyes flashing before he caught himself. He froze, realizing exactly what he'd admitted. The words hung in the air like a cold draft, lingering long after his mouth closed again. The doctor's jaw tightened, the advocate's pen paused over her notes, and even the soft hum of the hallway seemed to withdraw from the room. The silence that followed was absolute. Not angry, not chaotic, just the kind of silence that arrives when truth is too clear to ignore. My son looked at me then, truly looked, and in his eyes I saw something break. Not the plan, not the performance, but the last thin thread of trust he thought he still had. No one moved, no one needed to. The truth had already settled over all of us, heavy and undeniable, filling every corner of room 317. The advocate stayed behind after my son was escorted out, her voice steady as she explained the next steps. I watched her fill out the forms on a small tablet, each tap of her finger marking something official, something irreversible. She didn't dramatize anything. She didn't need to. The words elder abuse and medical manipulation stood on their own, cold and factual. Hearing them applied to my son settled into me like a weight I hadn't prepared to carry. Still, knowing someone was finally stepping in felt like a breath I'd been holding for far too long. By the time the administrator returned, the system had already updated. She showed me the screen on her clipboard, shaded blocks marking restricted access, alerts attached to my chart, red flags that would warn any staff member who opened my file. "He'll have no ability to make changes, request updates, or speak on your behalf," she said. Her tone wasn't comforting, it was firm, procedural, the kind of certainty I needed more than reassurance. I nodded, though a part of me still felt the sting of seeing my son's name listed under revoked access. The doctor checked on me shortly after. He didn't linger, but he paused long enough to make sure I understood the protections now in place. His calm made it easier to stay grounded, even as the emotional sting kept rising without warning. After he left, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Letting the truth settle, it wasn't the hospital's judgment that hurt. It was the fact that the system needed to protect me from my own child. That realization landed deeper than anything said in room 317. Word spread quietly through the family, just as I knew it would. A cousin called the nurse's station asking whether the accusations were real. A niece sent a message insisting it had to be a misunderstanding. Others stayed silent, choosing distance over involvement. Their reactions didn't surprise me, but they added a cold edge to everything that had already fractured. The people who should have stood with me instead hovered at the edges, unwilling to see my son clearly. Later that evening, I asked the nurse for a small notepad. I began listing names, updating contacts, crossing out people who no longer felt safe to rely on. I noted which keys needed replacing once I got home, which accounts needed new passwords, which permissions I had given too freely. It felt mechanical at first, but each step helped me reclaim something I'd been losing piece by piece. When I finally closed the notepad, the room felt different, quieter, still weighted, but steadier. I didn't feel triumph, I didn't feel anger, just a quiet acceptance settling in, a truth I didn't want but could no longer deny. Some distances protect more than they hurt, and this one, as painful as it was, might be the only thing keeping me alive. The house was quiet when I stepped back inside, the kind of quiet that comes after a long storm. I set my keys on the table and took a slow breath, letting the familiar space steady me. Nothing looked different, yet everything felt changed. I walked room to room, checking locks, making note of what needed updating, adjusting lamps and curtains the way I used to before others stepped in. Moving through my home at my own pace reminded me how much I'd let slip away without noticing. Taking it back felt like lifting myself from a long, heavy fog. In the following days, I settled into routines with a sharper awareness. I organized my medications on a shelf only I could reach and placed a small notebook beside them with dates and doses written in my own hand. I took back my mail key and asked the post office to hold anything picked up by someone else. Even unlocking a cabinet to file my documents felt like reclaiming something vital. I realized how dependency, slow, quiet, unnoticed, could become a doorway for someone else's control if you weren't paying attention. As I reviewed my papers, I thought about the nurse whose warning had cracked everything open. Her voice had been soft, almost cautious, but it carried a kind of bravery I didn't understand at the time. She didn't have to speak up. She didn't have to risk being wrong. But she saw something I was too tired or too trusting to see. I owe more than thanks to people like her, professionals who choose truth over convenience. Some nights, grief crept in without warning. Grief for the son I thought I had, for the trust I believed was mutual, for the idea that love could shield me from harm. Age teaches a man many things, but one of the harshest lessons is that betrayal doesn't need enemies. It sometimes walks in carrying your family name. Accepting that hasn't been easy, but ignoring it would have cost me far more. Still, there is a strange peace in rebuilding your life with both eyes open. I moved forward by setting boundaries no one could cross again. I updated passwords, adjusted access, and made sure my decisions stayed in my hands. Every step reminded me that independence is not pride, it's protection. Now, when I lock my front door at night, it isn't fear that guides me, it's clarity. A simple truth learned the hardest way in old age: your health and your choices are your lifeline. Guard them as if everything depends on it, because it does.